Hello everyone, I'm J.D. Seal, Vice President and Skyview Partners, and I want to welcome you to today's session on You've Passed Your Audit, Now What? During today's session, Carol Woodbury will discuss specific areas of security configuration that typically fall out of compliance, automation techniques to keep your system in compliance, as well as tips for avoiding future audit findings. We think you'll find this very interesting. Today's session is sponsored by Skyview Partners. Skyview Partners is committed to delivering products and services that not only provide our customers with sound advice, but also saves them time, reduces the cost, and simplifies the management of security, compliance, and administration. Today's presenter is Carol Woodbury, President and CTO of Skyview Partners. Prior to forming Skyview, now in excess of 10 years ago, Carol spent 16+ years at IBM in positions including Chief Engineering Manager and Security Architect for IBM's iSeries Security Group. Carol is also the author of the new book, which will be released in May 2012, IBM I, Security, Administration and Compliance. Pre-orders are currently available on MC Press Online. You will get this URL in and after the webinar email. Skyview products include Skyview Risk Assessor, our IBM I diagnostic tool, Skyview Policy Minder, the powerful automation of security administration to make sure your configuration stays the way your policy intends, the Skyview Audit Journal Reporter, which are predefined auditor-ready reports on security events recorded in the Audit Journal, as well as the Skyview Policy Minder for IBM AIX. And remember, at Skyview Partners, we don't charge for installation and basic configuration. Skyview also offers security checkups, specifically security checkups for J.D. Edwards as well, re-architecture and remediation services, as well as the new Skyview Managed Services. So that's the marketing part of our presentation, and I'd like to turn it over to Carol now on You've Passed Your Audit, Now What? Thanks for joining us. Carol?
Thanks, JD. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Let's get the screenshot up here. Okay, so JD, can you see my title page?
I can. Let me add a couple more things before Carol gets started. Again, if you have questions, we do like to keep this as interactive as possible, so type them into the questions dialog box. And also, we are recording this session. You will get a link to that recording after the webinar. And finally, there will be a link to the slides themselves that will be sent to you as well. So, okay, Carol?
Okay, thanks, JD. Again, I'll be presenting the topic of you passed the audit, now what? So the only thing on this title page that I'm trying to point out here is that I do have a Twitter feed, so if you want to follow me on Twitter, I am Carol Woodbury on Twitter. So that's kind of a fun thing to do. I promise not to tell you what I have eaten for lunch, okay? So that's the only caveat. So you will not be getting my lunch menu. But who knows what else you might get. It's mainly security related, but I do put a few personal tweets out there periodically. Okay, so let's get going. My guess is that this is how you look once you get the word that the auditor has come and gone and the report says that you have passed the audit. And rightly so. Passing an audit is certainly an accomplishment. There's a lot of work typically that goes into the preparation and just a lot of stress that goes on. So to celebrate the moment is certainly quite justified. The problem is once they go and once you celebrate the moment, you may want to try to save yourself some time and stress for the next audit by doing some prep work ahead of that. And so that's the topic of today's presentation. You know, Skyview Partners is really about trying to save you time and trying to take some of the pain and agony out of your security administration duties. So today we'll be talking about some of the automation opportunities that you can have with audit, things that are typically required through an audit. One of the things that a lot of people, I think, don't take the time to anticipate are the issues that might appear in next year's audit. and what you can do about that ahead of time. And so we'll talk about some of the ways that you can be proactive. So let's get going on this. Okay, so what I need you to do at this point in time is to think about the activities that you had to do before you were leading up to the last audit that you had. And I realize that some people may have annual audits, but we've also worked with clients that have multiple audits throughout the year, and it typically depends on the industry that you're in as to how many audits you might have. And there's different types of audits. But if you think about the types of activity and the specific things that you had to do leading up to those various audits, those are the activities I'd just like you to jot out. So, did you have to go through and make any changes? Did you have to run some reports? So when we work with clients in preparing for audits, we typically go through a set of kind of a checklist. So things like system values, we go in and we review the security relevant system values to make sure that they're set to best practices. So did you have to make any changes to system values? Did you have to go and review the user profile settings to make sure that users hadn't gotten too many special authorities? Did you need to go through an exercise to remove the inactive profiles? I've seen a lot of auditors come in and require that certain authorities or only certain authorities be set on certain database files. So did you have to review those and make any kind of changes to those? Those are the type of activities. So just think about that for a moment, take a sip of coffee, and think about those opportunities or those activities that you had to do. Okay, so then in addition to the changes that you might have had to make, I know a lot of what prep work for audits have to entail are the generation of reports. So again, if you just kind of think through and maybe jot down some of those reports that you had to generate. Typically, I see people having to generate reports on system value settings, definitely on user profile settings, and to a lesser degree on the authorities. Okay, so those are the places that you have automation opportunities. And again, what I really want you to stop and think about is how can you stop what I call the audit fire drill. There's always this, it's usually no less than a week and often up to a month. I've seen it up to 2 months of activity that is just a flurry of activity as people prepare for an auditor to come in. So stop the panic, stop the fire drill. There's will always probably be some angst and some a little bit of anxiety before an auditor shows, but you can stop the fire drill if you can automate some of these activities. Because if you think about it, those activities that you just wrote down on those reports that you just wrote down are probably things you do every year, or at least prior to the auditor coming in. So if you can somehow get that so that you don't have to hand generate those reports, save a lot of time. Okay, so not only will you save time and anxiety, but your system will be in perpetual compliance if you can automate this and have this be done on a regular basis. That's a benefit, especially if you come under any kind of regulatory requirements for compliance. It also has the opportunity to make the data more secure or less risk to the data. Now we'll talk about that later, because just because you're in compliance with something does not necessarily mean, but it has at least a chance of being more secure if the system is in compliance with more of the policies. Okay, so what I like to propose that people do is to develop a lifestyle that is conducive to staying in compliance. Now, if any of you have followed some of my postings, some of our newsletters, you know I started to run a couple years ago, and so this is very meaningful to me because as I prepare for races, it's important that I do some manner of running at least twice a week so that I can be in shape and be ready to do that race on the weekend. And so it's become a lifestyle for me to incorporate running in my daily routine, or at least in my weekly routine. So again, that's the type of thing that I want you to think about. How is it that you can automate these processes so that you can just incorporate it in your daily or weekly or monthly security administration tasks? Okay, so let's go on to the areas that, as we work with our customers, that we typically see fall out of compliance. And again, these are opportunities for automation. Okay, so if we take a look at things, top on the list are system values. Now, you would think that system values would stay stable, but they, from what I've seen, they don't. Now, there's a way to lock those down, actually, through the service tools, but some people actually feel that that's too restrictive and that they need to be able to more dynamically change system values. When you don't lock them down, they are often changed to either enable a function and they're never changed back, or I have seen vendors modify system values when they install their software and they don't change them back. So there's a number of ways that system values get changed from what your preferred setting is. And even on an upgrade, if people aren't restoring their system values when they change hardware, system values will come back and be at the system supply defaults rather than at your preferred defaults. So system values. User profile configuration. So a lot of times I see people having to scramble because they see a whole lot of profiles that are inactive. And often when they're inactive, they have default passwords. It's because the profile was created and then never used. I see a lot of people having to do a scramble to review the special authority assignments and also the group memberships. So what do you do to be able to automate some of these processes? Well, if you look at the Analyze Default Password command that ships with i5OS, if you run that on and review that on a regular basis, you can keep a handle on the profiles that are being created with a default password. And the better thing to do, of course, if you're going to stay in compliance with something, the best thing to do is to try to achieve security best practices wherever you can. So security best practices would say that you don't even create the profile with a default password. So one of the things that you might want to consider is to change the create user profile command so that you don't create the profiles with a default password. That would eliminate the issue right there. And then if you, on a regular basis, run the Analyze Default Password command, then you can see if there are any profiles that have gotten created that way. Okay, the next thing, and this is probably the biggest issue that I see happening, is that profiles are not managed, and so they age and they never are removed from the system. And so one of the things that you can do, if you, for those of you who have upgraded to V7 R1, you'll see in this chart that there is a new attribute on the create and change user profile command. That attribute allows you to set an expiration date or time period for a user profile. This is really handy, especially when you have temporary workers come in. You may have a consultant in when we come in for a remediation. You may have a, or I often get a temporary access, or one of my team gets a temporary access to the system. If you're on V7 R1, when we come in and help you, you can create us a profile that expires in 2 weeks. So that's pretty cool. So automatically the system would set that profile to be a status of disabled. But for those people that are not at V7 or 1, and I know that there are a number of you out there, there are the IBM security tools that allow you to set a time period where after that time period the system can automatically disable the profile after a certain period of inactivity. That tool is a little limiting. The only time that you get notification that a profile is going to be disabled is after it's been disabled. So you want to be a little bit careful with this tool. There are certainly vendors, certainly maybe one of the ones that is sponsoring this presentation this morning that has some automation tools along this line too. But the key here is that whatever tool you use it. And if you're going to write this yourself, make sure that you look at the right date. The one thing that I have talked to a lot of you about is which date do you use. So I think the biggest confusion and the biggest hesitation for removing profiles from the system is that the wrong date is examined. And you want to make sure that you're looking at the last used date versus the last sign-on date. And that will make sure that you don't delete profiles that are used for things like batch jobs or on connections like ODBC connections and that thing. You also might want to take a look at the creation date and the restore date. That's what we do with our tools. Because if the last used date is blank, you certainly don't want to be removing or disabling a profile that was just created last week, for example. So just some hints there. So again, from an automation point of view, if you can have a tool that is out there that is regularly looking for inactive profiles, say on a weekly basis. I know we have customers that look at that on a weekly basis. We also have customers that look at it on a monthly basis. Then if you think about it, when that auditor comes, number one, you have a documented process that you can show them for managing inactive profiles, and number two, you don't have to do that fire drill to clean up your system. So all in all, a much better way to do that. Okay, next. The next thing is to monitor special authorities. So the best way that I know of to make sure that you don't have a proliferation of user profiles with excess special authorities is to look at how you're creating user profiles. And I know that most people typically copy a user profile to create a new one. So the request comes in. I've seen these requests at our customers. The request comes in and it says, please create a user profile. Here's the user profile to copy. And the new employee gets the copy, all of the privileges of the profile being copied. That's fine, except that a lot of times the profile that's copied is a person that's been around for a while and therefore probably has more privileges than somebody that's just starting out should have. So what I like to do is help people to create what I call a template user profile that would give that new employee just the minimum amount of authority that they need, and certainly the minimum special authorities that they need to perform their job functions. And that way, if you can create that new profile based on that minimum amount, you're not copying other people's privileges and giving them more than what they need. So that's how that works really well for the people that we've helped develop that, and that would be what I would suggest in this case. Moving along, the other thing to do is to monitor who is a member of a group profile. So what I typically see happen is that it's usually a stated process when somebody leaves the company. Most people have a process in place to disseminate that information down. And so when you know to delete a profile, but what happens is that there's rarely communication when somebody changes jobs. And when somebody changes a job, they typically need different privileges, and often that comes by way of a group profile. And so they usually need an additional group profile. So you'll get the notification typically because somebody calls up or sends in a form that says, hey, I'm moving to this position, I need those privileges. So you add the group to that profile. And so they now have both their old group and their new group. Now what doesn't happen is notification for when they no longer have to backfill for their old job. So they remain with those additional authorities potentially for the life of their employment. So if you can review the member of the group profile, you'll catch those times where people have changed jobs and no longer need those privileges. The easiest way to do that, there's a couple different commands on i5OS that allow you to do that. One is the display user profile command, and you can ask for the member to list out the members of the group. You can also do a display authorized users and sequence it by members of groups. So either one of those will help you review the members of each group profile. Okay, the last thing that I tend to see move out of compliance are authorities to critical objects. And those are those files typically that contain either HR information or perhaps an authorization list that controls who can decrypt credit card information, that type of thing. And so you really need to make sure that you are reviewing on a regular basis who has authority to those objects. And obviously the authorities that you need to be reviewing are not just the private authorities, but the public authority to the objects, the authorization list, the ownership, and any kind of adopted authority settings. So again, this is just a list of the types of information that I typically see in the database files that auditors are asking to look at the authorities for. Okay, so when you're looking at authorization lists, don't forget to look at those. That is one thing that is very often ignored, who has authority to an authorization list. And I don't know why this happens, but it seems like authorization lists are the one place where people will often open them up from an authority perspective with the idea that that will solve some problem that's occurring on production. Even though there is no not authorized message anyplace, you know, programmers tend to leap to the conclusion that it's a security problem. And so if you're not monitoring your authorization list authorities, you will never catch the fact that it was opened up and never changed back. So the commands that you need to review your authorization list assignments: display authorization list, put the name of the authorization list, and you can send that to a spool file, or you can send it to an out file. You can also list the objects that are secured by the authorization list. Sometimes those authorization lists get what I call overloaded with objects that really don't belong in that list or to the purpose of that list. And so you can display the objects associated with that list. Now, one thing for those of you who are on V5R4, prior to V6R1, the operating system locks the authorization list when you list out the objects. The ramification of that is that if an entire application is secured by an authorization list, the objects for that application are locked. And so you may not be able to use the application while you're listing out the objects that are secured by the authorization list. So you may want to do that type of work off hours or submit it in a batch job to run at night, you know, hold the job and run it at night. But here are the commands that you need to use. Just be careful when you run it. Okay, so those are some specific things to i5OS, the tasks that you need to perform on i5OS to remain in that lifestyle of compliance and have opportunity to automate the review of those issues. The other things that you need to review are really more of a global issue and need to be done at least annually. Those things include things like your security policy. So you want to review it at least annually to make sure that you have included anything like new technology that's come along. So if your security policy, for instance, has not been reviewed for 5 years, there's probably nothing in that policy that talks about the appropriate use of social media, whether or not data can be downloaded to a smartphone or some sort of smart device, that type of thing. So you really want to make sure that your policy is reviewed on an annual basis to make sure that new technology and new issues are addressed. Also, if you have been part of or are participating in mergers and acquisitions, there's usually 2 cultures that need to be merged, or again, some new type of technology, maybe even a new operating system. We were just working with a client earlier this spring that had acquired a company, and they now had IBM I systems. So they asked us to review their security policy to make sure that anything that was unique to the IBM I was accommodated in that security policy because they were not familiar with the platform. The other reason you want to look at your security policy is to make sure that it includes anything that would be a requirement from some sort of new law or regulation. Again, if you think about it, if you have not reviewed your security policy for, say, 5 years, and you dealt with data like in Massachusetts, for example, there would be nothing in your policy that would accommodate the Massachusetts data privacy laws, and they are actually quite stringent. So just make sure that those are reviewed on at least an annual basis. One of the other things that you want to take a look at on an annual basis is your incident response plan. Now, a lot of people don't even have an incident response plan. So this might be your wake-up call or your thought process that you need an incident response plan. The typical thought is, oh, that's never going to happen to us. We're never going to have an incident. We trust our employees. They don't have enough knowledge to be able to do anything damaging. I've really heard every excuse possible for not having an incident response plan. The point is you really need to at least think through what would happen if a breach occurred, or it may not even be a breach. Perhaps your system is a target of a denial of service attack, either internally, which I've seen an increase in, or externally. You need to have a plan in place to know what you would do in that case. And it's kind of that Boy Scout motto, always be prepared. If you have never thought through what you would do in this case, and you have an incident, you're going to be, talk about a fire drill. You're really going to be in drill mode at that point in time. So once your plan is in place, you'll want to make sure that you do review it on an annual basis so that the new threats are accounted for, new techniques in incident responses are accounted for or documented, the contacts are updated, and so forth. And again, if you haven't done any kind of planning like this, one thing that you'll seriously want to consider is getting a retainer with a company that specializes in investigating incidents. So you don't have to try to find that company at the time of the incident. And you can have a much more rapid response if you have that retainer in place. Okay, another thing that you'll want to review on an annual basis is your employee awareness program. And again, the reason you want to do that is that you want to marshal the troops. You want to make sure that everyone in your organization is fighting the fight against inappropriate use of data, and that they can help you identify where data is being exposed inappropriately or used inappropriately. So the thing that you'd want to review is to make sure that any new policy issues are communicated, ones that are appropriate for your employees. Again, the social media example is a great example there. Awareness about new threats. So again, different types of phishing schemes or spamming schemes that have come out are good things to put out in your annual employee awareness type of bulletin. Also, the requirements from any kind of new laws or regulations. Those would be great things to communicate at this point too. Now again, from an annual point of view, and again from a preparation for your auditor, just make sure that your documentation for all your processes is accurate and that you're actually following it. It's, and I've checked this with auditors, it's actually worse to have documentation that's out of date or not being followed than having no documentation at all. So make sure that your documented processes are up to date and get rid of documentation for processes that are no longer followed. And make sure that if you have any new processes, those are documented accurately. Things that come up, now this is an anticipation of new laws and regulations. A lot of you have dealt with having to encrypt data, whether it's PCI data or you have chosen to encrypt other data, social security numbers, social insurance numbers, bank accounts, that type of thing. A lot of you have dealt with encryption. So one of the things to stay on top of and not just let happen from an auditor perspective are things like your key management issues, documented key management issues. Make sure that you have a process in place if the key gets compromised or the people holding the keys leave the company. Just be proactive in your planning for how you're managing encryption. So again, I've kind of started that proactive theme here. So one of the other ways that you can be proactive and prepare for an audit is to watch for updates to new laws and regulations. And there's a lot of ways to do that, and I know that you're busy. But if you put this in your mind as one of those things you want to pay attention to, I know how your brains work, and once you get this idea in your head, it just kind of sits there. It's like a batch job, a never-ending batch job, and periodically it spits out a report. Well, if you have this never-ending batch job watching for updates to laws and regs, when one of those updates comes out, it's like this message that gets sent, a notification that gets sent in your brain that says, oh, pay attention to this one. So there's a lot of ways to find this out. You know, if you listen to any kind of business news program, they typically talk about new laws and regulations and how they affect businesses. There's publications in people's vertical space, so in the financial space, in the banking space, there's publications specifically tuned to those. They definitely talk about new laws and regulations. We try to, at Skyview Partners, have regular webcasts on laws and regulations that affect data that could be on the IBM I. So you can sign up for our webinars and get notifications that way. You can sign up for our newsletters that talk about these new laws and regulations as well. So in preparation for new laws and regulations, and again from an audit perspective, the best thing that you can do for yourself is to implement security best practices wherever that's practical or wherever that's possible. And where it isn't possible, document the areas where best practices can't be met. Now, we've been working with some clients the past couple weeks, and they have a process that uses a profile with a default password. But they've taken steps and they have compensating controls around that profile, and so their internal audit has signed off on the use of that profile that has the default password. So that's the type of thing that I'm talking about. So in their documentation, they describe how this profile is used. the specific compensating controls that they've put in place to protect the use of that and limit the use of that profile. And so therefore that's how they were able to get a sign-off from their internal audit. I realize that not everybody can go for best practices. So these types of exceptions definitely occur, but you will be steps ahead with your auditor if you've taken the time to document it up front. That shows the auditor that you have taken the consideration and made the consideration from a business perspective and made the business choice to not follow best practices. Again, that saves you the time when the auditor is on site of trying to come up with that documentation, come up with that justification, and will put you in better standing with the auditor to do it ahead of time. The other thing that you can do to prepare for future laws and regulations is to engage your development group when you know that change is coming, so that they're aware of it, so that the projects that they have in the pipeline can be tuned to those laws and regulations versus having to retrofit them. Now, the other thing that you can do is to what I call friend your auditors. And when I say friend your auditors, don't view them as the enemy, but view them as the person that can help you with your compliance requirements and to make sure that you have as little work to do leading up to those audits as possible because you're prepared. So one of the things that you can do is obviously get those policies and procedures updated and document your exceptions. We've been talking about that. The other thing that you can do is to have work plans ready for the issues that are known but have not yet been addressed. One of the things that just kind of baffles me and surprises me is the number of people that don't go back and look at the prior year's audit before the auditor comes again this year. I don't know why that doesn't occur to people, but it seems to not occur to people to do that. So one of the best things that you can do is go back and look at last year's audit and make sure that all of those issues have been resolved that may not have been raised as exceptions, but were footnotes or areas of concern. Because if they were areas of concern last year, sure as I'm drinking coffee this morning, they will be issues on the radar, and they will look at those issues this year. So if you haven't had the time or the budget to address them between the audit, one of the things that you can do is to write up the work plan that resolves the issue that they note and have the work plan in place and say, okay, this is the plan that we have to address the issue. We just have not had that in the budget to fix it, or whatever the excuse is that you haven't done that thing. But have the work plans ready so that you can know and make sure that the auditor knows that you understand the issue. Make sure that they know that you have considered the issue and that you have plans in place once that issue becomes a priority. The other thing that you can do to prepare for your auditor, again, is to have that compliance lifestyle. So if you have those records that prove that you have been checking those items that we talked about earlier on a regular basis, they will know that you are in tune with your system and are making an effort to make sure it stays in compliance. And also, by providing the information, a lot of times auditors will ask for things prior to their arrival. If you make sure that you have those reports ready, then they aren't sitting around waiting for those reports when they're on site and thinking of other things that they can ask you for. So make sure that those reports are ready when they come on site. And again, address the previous audit findings. Now again, remember that being in compliance or passing your audit does not necessarily mean that your systems and data are secure, but they have a better chance of being in security if you can make sure that you develop that compliance lifestyle. Now, I often get questions when we are doing our security checkup service. That's something that we compare current settings to best practices. One of the questions I typically get is, where do I get these best practices? So there's several resources that you can go to for security best practices. The ISO organization has some specific ISO standards for security best practices. So those are listed. COBIT, that is a process for evaluating risk in the IT environment and managing risk. They actually came out with their latest upgrade. It's COBIT 5, so that's available from ISACA. You can get the latest security standards from the payment card industry through, we keep a link to that off of our website. IBM best practices come from both the Security Reference Manual as well as my book, and as JD said, there's a new version coming out in May, and Security Reference Manual. And of course, if you have questions, you can always contact us at Skyview Partners, and we'll be glad to point you in the right direction. And I think we have a couple extra minutes. If you have questions, don't hesitate to type those in, and we'll get those answered for you. And in the meantime, I think we have some poll questions for you, some fun questions.
Thank you, Carol. We do have one poll that I can start up. I did answer actually a couple of questions that were very similar while you were on, and they were asking about our security re-architecture. And I can certainly get back to those people and give them the details of that service, but maybe you could touch base on what auditors react to a system that is properly architected. And I will start our session, our poll question, if you want.
Well, certainly an auditor appreciates the fact that time has been spent and the effort has been made to appropriately secure data. And when I talk about appropriately securing data, people may assume that I always come in and set every object on the system to be public exclude, and that's not the methodology that Skyview Partners uses. What we do is to come in and help you figure out from your organization's perspective what your security requirements are. So perhaps the data is just fine at read-only, or perhaps there are a few data files that need to be set to deny by default with only a handful of users being able to access them. But whatever your requirements are, that's what we discover, and then we architect a solution to make sure that the object authorities are set accordingly. So a lot of times the re-architecture is driven by the fact that the auditors have discovered that the system may not be running at the right security level, or everybody has all object. And while not every auditor understands an I-Series or IBM I, there are some auditors that do. And so if you get one of those, then you're in the situation where you have to put plans in place to actually correct those types of issues and make sure that the auditor's requirements are met. And that's where that re-architecture comes in.
Okay. We had a little bit more than half of you answer our poll question. If you have any other questions, please type them into the box. Carol, I've passed one question along to you that I have to admit I did not read because I'm managing the poll at the moment.
Okay,
so
not a problem.
Some questions are answerable online and some are offline, so if it's not online, then
this one's a good one. I think a lot of people have this issue regardless. So the question is, this person is part of a privately held company, and people don't like change. So how do we address that? The portion about people don't like change applies regardless of whether you're a privately held company or a publicly held company and have all manner of of regulatory requirements. The best thing that you can do for people who don't like change is to help them understand the ramifications if you don't make change, and put it in terms of your business. I'm actually in the middle of writing a white paper about how much security is enough, and one of the sections in that white paper talks about the value of the data to the business. And even if your data does not fall under regulatory compliance, your business runs off of that data typically. And often in the case of IBM the data on the IBM is the heart and soul of the business. So if you think about that data and the fact that it could somehow be compromised, either from a malicious point of view, or it's actually more likely from an accidental point of view, and put that in business terms, that's typically the best way that you can convince somebody to make change. And sometimes we've actually gone in and shown upper management how easy it is to get at data. I remember being at a client one time where the HR director didn't believe the fact that just anybody could see the HR data. They were convinced that it could only be seen by a handful of users, which was true if you went through the application itself. But our point was that the database access controls had been left wide open. So we just simply downloaded the data into an Excel spreadsheet while we actually had the HR director press the enter key, and we turned around, and the spreadsheet was populated with the HR data. And she nearly fell off her chair. I thought she was going to kind of pass out there. So sometimes it takes an example to show people how data is exposed or how easily it would be to corrupt a database, just simply by clicking on the wrong icon to upload data rather than download it. So probably the best way to show somebody and to convince them that change is needed is to put it in a business perspective, to say how the business, and show them how the business could be affected if the data isn't secured properly.
And let me add a couple of things to that in my experience, not as much as Carol's, but first of all, the fact that you've never had a problem in the past is really not a very good defense if something does go wrong. So I've heard that told to me a number of times, and it really doesn't carry a lot of weight. I think you probably are aware of that. The second, more salient point is that in most cases, properly done, change will be more effective, will require fewer resources going forward than what most people are currently doing. So I think if you look at it from a return on investment type of basis, I think you can show that the properly managed change, managed so that it's tested to not negatively affect current operations, and you'll see going forward to have a positive effect on the resources required, meaning less resources required going forward to maintain the structure that you want.
Right. Like if you are managing your system by hand, by running reports and having to do visual comparisons, or look at a report of user profiles and decide, again, kind of by hand, which ones have not been active and can be set to status of disabled. If you're doing those manual processes, if you automate those, you definitely get a return on your investment. So here's another question. What is the official name for AS400? Is it i5 or is it IBM I? The current official name is IBM I. Who knows what they might change it to in the future, but IBM's current official name is IBM I. I've also heard it referred to as Power I, so, pick a name. We all know what it is. All right, if there's no more questions, if there's no more questions, I think we're done for the day.
Well, I want to thank you all for joining us today.